The candles in the parish records room had burned low by the time she understood what she was looking at. Cicely Barrow stood at the long oak table with both registers open before her, the old one and the new, their spines nearly touching in the thin light. The handwriting in the old register was her father's, careful and upright, the letters formed with the mild precision of a man who had kept Windermere's births and deaths and marriages for 31 years without error. The handwriting in the new register was her father's also, or it was a very good likeness of it, which was not at all the same thing. She had found the discrepancy by accident. She had been checking the dates in preparation for the morning, when the solicitor, Mr. Alderton, would arrive from London, and the Ashmore family would assemble in the long drawing room of Windermere Park to hear the late Earl's final testamentary provisions read aloud. Baby William, Thomas Ashmore's son and heir, 14 months old, and asleep in the nursery above the stable wing, stood to inherit the Windermere entail in its entirety. Or he had stood to inherit it until someone had opened the register of christenings and changed the date of his birth by 9 days. 9 days. A small and surgical alteration. The ink in the new entry was slightly too bright, the pressure of the pen marginally too consistent, the loop of the letter W in William just slightly too neat for a man who had written W 10,000 times and worn the habit of it down to something more natural. Cecily had looked at that letter W for a long time. Then she had looked at it again. The door of the records room opened without a knock. Lady Dorothea Ashmore wore black, as she had worn black every day since her husband's death 2 years prior. But she wore her mourning the way some women wore diamonds, with a settled and comfortable authority. She was 63 years old, and she had managed Windermere in every sense that mattered for the past 30 years, while her late husband managed his club and his gout. She stood in the doorway with the candle she had carried, and she looked at the 2 open registers on the table, and at Cecily standing between them. "I thought I might find you here," she said. Cecily did not move from her position beside the table. Her hand rested near the old register. She did not touch it. "You are thorough," Lady Dorothea said. She came forward 2 steps and set her candle on the corner of the table. "Your father was thorough also. It was his most useful quality." She looked at the register. "And his most inconvenient one." "The date has been altered," Cecily said. She kept her voice level. "It cost her something to do so, has it?" Lady Dorothea's tone was not a question. It was the tone of a woman who had decided before she entered the room what shape this conversation would take. "Baby William was born on the 4th of March. He was christened on the 12th. That is what my father recorded. And it is what I will say tomorrow morning when Mr. Alderton asks me whether the register is accurate and in good order." A silence settled over the room. The candles threw the dowager's shadow long and still across the flagstone floor. "She is only the clerk's girl," Lady Dorothea said, and though she addressed the statement to no one in the room, it landed precisely where it was meant to land. "She cannot be made to matter." Then, turning to Cecily directly, she said, "The living that supports this room and the house attached to it belongs to the estate. You understand that?" Cecily understood it. "My late husband was fond of your father," the dowager continued. "I am prepared to extend that regard to you for a period, provided you exercise appropriate discretion about matters that are not your concern." Cecily looked at the register. She thought of baby William asleep above the stable wing, 14 months old, with his father's ears and his grandmother's calculating eyes, which was perhaps an unfortunate combination. She thought of Thomas Ashmore, who had died of a fever 2 winters ago on his small Hampshire estate, and who had been cut off from his family in the months before his death, in ways that had never been satisfactorily explained. She thought of her father's hand and of the letter W and of the way the dowager had said, "She cannot be made to matter without looking at her." "I will see you at the reading tomorrow," Cecily said. She closed both registers. She did not look at Lady Dorothea again. Her father, James Barrow, had kept the parish records of Windermere for 31 years, and had been, by the account of everyone who had known him, a man of moderate height, moderate opinions, and immoderate care for the written word. He had died of a chest inflammation in February, when the cold came down from the hills and found the gaps in the records house walls where the plaster had been meaning to be repaired for several years. He had left Cecily the records room, the records, the habit of precision, and a name that the village used as a practical noun. The clerk's daughter, the clerk's girl. A pair of capable hands attached to a set of neat columns, useful in the way that a well-made table is useful, and noticed in roughly the same fashion. She was 23 years old. She had been educated at the small school her father had helped to fund, and then by her father's own library, which ran to 4 shelves of history, 2 of natural philosophy, 1 of poetry she had read so many times. The bindings had softened, and a complete set of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, which she had found as gripping as any novel. She was not beautiful in the way that Windermere's season recognized beauty. She was slight and brown-haired, and had her father's quality of stillness, which in him had read as scholarly composure, and in her was generally read as plainness. She wore gray most days, because gray did not show ink. The inheritance reading had been scheduled for 3 months following the late Earl's death, delayed by various disputes about the London solicitors and various further disputes about which set of London solicitors ought to be managing the disputes about the first solicitors, and by the time Mr. Bailly Alderton had been agreed upon and dispatched to Windermere, the household had settled into a waiting that felt less like anticipation than like the particular held breath before a storm. Lady Dorothea presided over the park with her customary efficiency. The cousin, Mr. Clesht, Gerald Harwick, had arrived from Derbyshire a week ago, with his valet and his intended, a Miss Honoria Vale, who wore lavender and spoke in the careful, unhurried cadences of a woman who had been told all her life that she was the correct answer to any question. And Edward Ashmore, the new Earl of Windermere, had come home from the Continent. Cecily had first seen him 3 days ago, through the records house window, as his carriage came up the West Drive in the early evening. He had stepped down from the carriage and stood for a moment in the cold air, looking at the front face of the house, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that had made her set down her pen and watch. He was tall and broad-shouldered and dressed in a dark coat, and he did not move for a long time. He simply looked at the house, the way a man looks at something he was not certain he still had a right to. Then he went inside. She had not spoken to him yet. She had not expected to be spoken to. On the second morning after his arrival, a footman appeared at the records house door, with a note on Ashmore paper. The Earl requested the presence of Miss Barrow at the park, at her earliest convenience, regarding several questions pertaining to the parish records. The handwriting was firm and upright, and gave nothing away. She put on her second-best dress, which was grey wool with a white collar, and she walked the quarter-mile to the park in the December cold, and was admitted to the study by a footman who looked through her, rather than at her, which was a habit the Windermere staff had developed over years of dealing with the clerk's daughter. He rose when she entered. She had not expected that. He was perhaps 34, with dark hair, and a face that weather and something harder than weather had worked on, until it was very still and very controlled, the kind of face that gives you nothing without deciding to give it. He gestured to the chair across the desk and sat when she had sat. "Miss Barrow," he said, "I am told you have maintained the parish records since your father's death." "Yes, my lord. I have some questions about the records relating to my brother's household, his marriage, his son's birth, and christening. I want to be certain of the documents before tomorrow." Cecily looked at him carefully. He had said this without emphasis and without anything that she could read as strategy, but she had spent the better part of 2 days thinking about the altered register, and she was past assuming that any question about those documents was accidental. "I have the documents in my custody," she said. "All of them." He looked at her. "All of them. My father kept copies of certain records here, as a matter of practice." He felt that a second set held separately was a sensible precaution. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not quite to openness, but in that direction, the way a window shifts toward a latch without fully releasing. "I would like to see them," he said. "I will bring them tomorrow morning, before the reading. He accepted this without pressing. She was almost back to the door when he spoke again, his voice not quite different, but quieter. "My brother," he said. "Was he in good health? The last time you saw him, before he left Winmere?" She turned. He was not looking at her. He was looking at something on the surface of the desk that was not there. "He was well," she said. "He came to my father to file the notice of his marriage. He was very glad." She paused. "He spoke of you." The muscle along his jaw moved once, like a stone shifting under pressure. "Thank you, Miss Barrow," he said. His voice was level. The words had cost him. She walked back to the records house in the cold and sat for a long time at her father's table, with her hands flat on the wood, thinking about the letter W and about the way he had looked at his dead brother's name. She was still sitting there in the late afternoon when the door of the records house opened without a knock, for the second time in as many days. This time, it was not Lady Dorothea. The undercook's boy, a child of perhaps 7, named Pip, stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands and a look of determined apology on his face. He had been sent, he said, to tell the clerk's daughter that Mrs. St. Paget had asked whether she might come to look at the kitchen inventory book, as there was a sum that did not add correctly and the housekeeper did not wish to bother the Earl with it. Not tonight. Cecily went. She spent an hour in the kitchen with the inventory book, while Pip watched from the doorway with the focused attention of a child who has learned that watching useful people do useful things is its own kind of education. She found the error. A footman had transposed 2 figures in the column for November's coal delivery. It was a small thing and easily corrected, and she wrote the correction in the margin in her father's hand, which was also her hand, and signed it so there would be no question. When she stood to go, Mrs. Hacks. Paget pressed a cloth-wrapped parcel of bread and cheese into her hands without looking at her, which was the housekeeper's version of a declaration. She was crossing back through the service passage when she became aware that she was not alone in it. She did not hear footsteps. She felt the change in the air, the quality of a space that has 2 people in it, instead of 1, and she turned. Edward stood at the far end of the passage. He had come from the direction of the stables in his coat and boots, and he had stopped when he saw her. The passage was lit by a single lamp, and the light was not generous, but it was enough. He had been there long enough to have seen her leave the kitchen with the parcel, long enough to have seen the correction in the inventory book. If he had come forward to look over her shoulder, which she had not noticed, and which she could not now determine whether he had or had not done, he said nothing. She said nothing. She was holding the cloth-wrapped parcel, and the cold was coming in from the passage door behind him, and there was no sensible reason for either of them to be in this passage at this hour. "Good evening, my lord," she said, and went on. She heard him say, very quietly, "Good evening, Miss Barrow," and then the passage was behind her and she was in the cold air of the path with her bread and cheese and a sensation in her chest that she was not prepared to examine. If she had told the truth, she would have said she was frightened. She had also felt, since the moment she had understood what she was looking at in those 2 registers, a quality of purpose that was not entirely different from calm. Her father had kept his records correctly for 31 years. He had told her once that the register was the only honest account the parish had of itself, that everything else, the gossip and the verdicts and the annual rewriting of who mattered and who did not, could be revised. But the register stood. It would still stand in the morning. She intended to see to that. She did not see Lady Dorothea again that day. She saw Miss Vale briefly in the lane outside the records house, where Miss Vale was walking with her maid, and looked at Cecily with the polite blankness of someone who has been told there is a person of no consequence in the vicinity, and has decided to take the assessment on faith. Surely no one would credit the word of a clerk's girl over the Dowager Countess, Miss Vale was saying to her maid, loudly enough to be heard as Cecily passed. It was possible this had been addressed to the maid. It was equally possible it had not. Cecily went inside and looked at the register until the light was too low to see by. Then she looked at the letter in the parish files. She had found it while organizing her father's correspondence 3 weeks after his death. It was a letter from Thomas Ashmore to her father, written some 7 months before Thomas's marriage, asking a practical question about the correct form for filing bans. The handwriting was clear and unguarded, the hand of a young man who had learned his letters at a good school, and then largely forgotten them, using them to dash off necessary communications with no particular attention to elegance. The loop of his letter W was open and slightly uneven. The pen pressure was light. It was not the same hand as the altered entry in the register. She had not known, until she compared the 2 documents side by side, what this meant. Now, she knew. She also knew that among her father's files, carefully preserved, was a second letter, not from Thomas, but bearing Thomas's name as subject, written in a hand she could not immediately identify, directing the estate to disregard all further correspondence from Thomas Ashmore. She had assumed it was a copy of a family communication. She had not, until now, looked closely at the hand. She looked at it now. She did not sleep much that night. At 7:30 the following morning, Cecily put on her best dress, which was gray wool with a better collar, and walked to the park with her father's copy registers under her arm and the parish letter files in a leather satchel. The footman admitted her with his usual quality of not quite seeing her, and she was standing in the corridor outside the study when she heard the voices from the morning room. She would have passed on, but one of the voices was Lady Dorothea's, and the other was Edward's, and the third was a woman she did not recognize, but whose tone had the particular warmth of someone who considers a conversation already won. "The girl has been troublesome," Lady Dorothea was saying. "I went to speak with her last evening, and she was quite impertinent. I confess I am concerned she may attempt to introduce some confusion into the proceedings." "On what basis?" Edward's voice was quieter than the dowager's and carried better. "She is, after all, only the clerk's daughter. No particular standing, no particular income, no particular connections." A pause. "I would not ordinarily concern myself with what such a person might say or not say, but given the sensitivity of tomorrow's proceedings, I felt it prudent to mention it. And Miss Barrow said something to you last evening that concerned you." Another pause. Longer this time. "She has developed certain ideas about the christening register." The silence that followed was of a different quality. Cecily stood in the corridor with her satchel and her registers, and did not breathe. "The register is in perfect order," Lady Dorothea said. "I am sure it is," Edward said. He did not say it in a way that meant he was sure. Cecily moved on down the corridor. Her heart was beating in a way she was doing her best to ignore, a quick, insistent percussion that she associated with moments when the body knew something the mind had not finished deciding. She had not told Edward about the altered entry. She had told him only about the copies. She wondered how much he had worked out on his own, and whether that was more or less than she thought, and whether she had made a mistake in not speaking more plainly yesterday. She had not made a mistake. She had waited because she wanted the documents in front of him when she spoke, and she had the documents. "Now, Mrs. Paget, the housekeeper, found her in the corridor and looked at her with an expression that managed to convey both steady competence and a very old anxiety. "Mr. Alderton has arrived," Mrs. Paget said. "He is in the library." "His lordship asked that you be brought to him directly," she added very quietly before she turned away. "Your father kept those records right for 30 years, Miss Barrow. Right is right." The library at Windermere Park had books along 3 walls and a fire that had been burning since early morning, and it smelled of leather and old paper and the cold that crept in from the windows, regardless of the fire's efforts. Alderton was a small, careful man, with the look of someone who had been reading documents for so long that he had begun to resemble one, precise and slightly faded at the edges, full of more information than his exterior suggested. He rose when Cecily entered. Edward was already there, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Gerald Harwick was there also. He was a florid man of 50, with the confident bearing of someone who had come a long way for something he considered already settled. Lady Dorothea sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fire. Miss Vale sat beside her, in lavender, with her hands folded. "Miss Barrow," Edward said. "Thank you for coming." He said it as if she had been invited, rather than simply necessary, and something about that particular courtesy, small as it was, settled her. She set the leather satchel and the registers on the library table. She opened the copy register to the relevant pages. She set beside it the letter from Thomas Ashmore to her father, with its clear, uneven hand and its open looping. She set beside that the letter bearing Thomas's name as subject, directing the estate to disregard his correspondence, and she put her finger on the W in that document, without speaking. No one in the room spoke either. Mr. Alderton put on his spectacles and bent over the documents. He was quiet for some time. Gerald Harwick made a sound that was not quite a word. Lady Dorothea did not move. "There is a further document," Cecily said. She drew from the satchel her father's original register, the one she had found in the second cabinet, and opened it to the christening record. She laid it beside the copy. She pointed to the date. "The original register records baby William's birth on the 4th of March, she said. "The copy which my father kept as a matter of course, in a separate location, records the same date. The document presently in the custody of the estate, which I believe was the register submitted to Mr. Alderton's office for verification, records a date 9 days later. The 9th of March. That date, if accurate, would render the child born outside the terms of the entail, as written by the late Earl, a silence of some duration." Gerald Harwick said, "This is absurd." "It is not absurd," Mr. Alderton said. He had been looking at the dates. He had also been looking at the W. He straightened up and removed his spectacles. "It is a serious matter." Lady Dorothea rose from her chair. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of something built to withstand considerable weight, and withstanding it still, though with effort. "She is the clerk's girl," she said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "Whatever she has brought in that satchel is, at best, a set of unofficial papers of uncertain provenance. At worst, it is the very forgery of which she should be suspected, manufactured to create precisely this confusion. She has no standing in this room. She has no authority over these documents. She cannot be permitted to introduce chaos into these proceedings on the strength of her own unsupported word." The room held very still. Cecily was aware of her own heartbeat. She was aware of the fire's sound, and of the cold behind the windows, and of the weight of the registers under her hands. She did not look at the Dowager. She looked at Mr. Alderton, who was looking at the documents, and she waited. She had always been good at waiting. It was one of the few advantages of being a person the room had decided not to see. The solicitor's clerk, a young man named Fenton, who had been standing near the door with a notebook, cleared his throat. He looked at Mr. Alderton. "Sir," he said very quietly, "she came to the office 2 weeks ago. The clerk's girl from the village. She reported a concern about the register. Then I should have passed it on." He had not. Mr. Schla. Alderton absorbed this information with the expression of a man filing it carefully for later examination and returning his attention to the present difficulty. Edward Ashmore turned from the window. He had not spoken since Cecily had begun laying documents on the table. He had watched, and she had been aware of his watching. In the way one is aware of warmth from a fire, without quite turning to face it, a presence registered before it is examined. Now, he crossed the room in 3 strides, not hurriedly but with a settled deliberateness. And he stood beside the library table and looked at the documents she had laid out. Then he looked at his stepmother. "Miss Barrow read that register correctly," he said. "Her account stands. It was not loud. It was not long. It landed in the room the way a key turns in a lock, with a small, precise click that changes everything on the other side of the door." Lady Dorothea's hand was at her fan, and the fan was not moving. Miss Vale had very carefully turned her face toward the window. Gerald Harwick looked at his solicitor, who had the expression of a man who had understood, some seconds ago, that he was on the wrong side of the room. "The original register," Mr. Alderton said after a silence of sufficient weight to constitute a verdict, "and the copy, which appears consistent in every particular, indicates that the child was born on the 4th of March. The document in the estate's custody contains an error which must be corrected before any disposition of property can proceed." "Error," Lady Dorothea said. "Error, Mr. C." Alderton said, in a tone that was the equivalent of a door closing gently but finally. "There was more after that. There was a considerable amount more." The solicitor asked his questions. The documents were formally examined side by side. Gerald Harwick retreated from confidence into bluster and then into silence, and Lady Dorothea departed the room with a composure that was the most absolute ruin Cecily had ever watched a person achieve in perfect stillness. Mr. Alderton asked Cecily several careful questions and wrote her answers down. Mrs. Paget was sent for and confirmed in the clear voice of a woman who has been waiting a long time to be asked the right question. That baby William had been born on the 4th of March. She had been present. She had counted the hours. She was certain. By 11:30, the terms of the late Earl's will were being read. By noon, baby William, who was unaware of these proceedings and had spent the morning eating porridge, had been confirmed in his inheritance. Gerald Harwick left before dinner. Miss Vale left with him in lavender, without speaking to anyone, which was perhaps the most tactful decision she had made since arriving at Windermere. Cecily gathered her documents and put them back in the satchel, and carried them back to the Records House in the early afternoon, when the light had come out, gray and cold and thin over the park. She walked slowly. She had not walked slowly in 2 weeks, and she had forgotten what it felt like. The ordinary unhurried pace of a person with no imminent catastrophe to prevent. She set everything in its proper place in the proper cabinet, in the order her father had established, which was also the order she would have established, because she had learned it young and it had become her own. She cleaned the nib of her pen. She boiled water for tea over the small grate and sat at her father's table with her hands around the cup, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a long period of being afraid and then not being afraid anymore, which is its own particular variety of heaviness. The Records House was very quiet. The light through the old windows was pale and slanted. Pip had left a small bunch of winter berries on the doorstep, which she did not know the significance of, but which she suspected was his version of Mrs. Pishon. Kes. Paget's bread and cheese, and she put them in a cup on the windowsill, where they would catch whatever light the afternoon had left to offer. She was still sitting there when she heard the footstep on the Records House path. She had told herself since this morning that whatever he chose to do next was his own concern and not something she should allow herself to anticipate. She had told herself this several times and had not entirely believed it, and when she heard the door she stood up before she had decided to stand up, which was, she supposed, an answer of sorts. He ducked slightly, coming through the doorway because the Records House had been built in an earlier century for people of a different scale, and stood for a moment looking around the room, with the careful attention of a man who has not been inside it before and is taking its measure. The shelves, the cabinets, the long oak table with its scarred surface, the pale winter light from the 2 small windows. Then he looked at her. "I have not thanked you," he said. "You had no need. The register is the register. It says what it says. That is not all it says." He came a step into the room and stopped, with the particular controlled stillness she had noticed in him since his arrival. "You found the discrepancy 3 weeks ago. You came to the solicitor's office and reported it, and were not believed. You kept the documents. You came this morning, knowing my stepmother had already decided what your role in this story would be." She said nothing. "I would like to know," he said more quietly, "what you thought would happen to you if it had gone the other way." She had thought about this. She had thought about the living attached to the Records House, which was technically at the estate's discretion. She had thought about her father's library, which would not help her pay rent on another set of rooms. She had thought about the word of a clerk's girl against the word of a dowager countess, and how that calculation typically resolved in rooms like the library at Windermere Park. "I thought I would manage," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite readable, but that had in it something that was not detachment. "Yes," he said, I expect you would have. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded letter. He held it for a moment without opening it, as a man holds something he has carried so long he is not sure he knows how to put it down. "My brother," he said. "There was a letter. It was supposed to be from Thomas, telling me that I had destroyed the relationship, that he wanted no further contact." He looked at the letter. "I received it 2 years ago. I believed it. I wrote back once and he did not answer. And then he was ill. And then he was dead. And I have spent 2 years believing he died, thinking I had abandoned him." Cecily looked at the letter in his hand. She had seen the hand it was written in. It was not Thomas Ashmore's hand. Way. She went to the second cabinet and opened the lower drawer and drew out her father's file of Thomas Ashmore's correspondence, the practical letters about bans and notices and records, and she put it on the table and opened it. She did not say anything. She put her finger on the W in Thomas's letter to her father, and then she stepped back so he could come and stand beside the table and look. He came and stood beside the table and looked. The fire in the small grate made the only sound in the room for a very long time. Cecily could hear the slight shift of his breathing, and then the stillness of it. And then he put his hand flat on the table beside the open file and did not move. He did not write it. He said, "No," she said. Another silence. She was very aware of his hand on the table, 3 inches from her own, and of the quality, of the quiet between them, which was not the quiet of distance, but of 2 people in the same small space who are both aware of it. "My stepmother managed a great deal," he said at last in a voice that had something in it she was not going to name. "Over a long time. Yes, she managed my brother's correspondence. She managed the register." He was quiet for another moment. She had also managed, for some years, to ensure that every woman who might have suited me was presented to me as unsuitable, and every woman she approved was presented at her best advantage. He straightened up from the table. He was very close to her, which the small room made inevitable and which neither of them moved to alter. "She was thorough," he said. "I will credit her with that." Cecily thought of the dowager standing in this room the previous night with her candle. She cannot be made to matter. It had been meant to wound, and it had, in the way that true things wound even when they are being deployed as weapons. "She was wrong about some things," Cecily said. "She was wrong about you." He said it simply and directly, in the way of a man who has decided to stop managing the distance between what he thinks and what he says. She felt the warmth of it before she had entirely processed the words. A small involuntary flush at the base of her throat that she was quite certain he could see, in this light, at this distance, but found she could not manage to regret. "I should go," she said, and did not go. He reached out and very carefully, with a precision that was somehow more intimate than haste would have been, covered her hand with his where it lay on the table beside the open file. "Not yet," he said. She looked at his hand over hers. Her heartbeat, which she had been managing quite successfully since that morning, stopped managing itself and did something she chose not to examine too closely. "No," she said. "Not yet." If you have stayed with Cecily this far, leave a word in the comments. She has been quiet for a long time, and it is good to know she is heard. The weeks that followed were practical and slow, as reckonings in Windermere tended to be. The solicitor's questions were answered, the formal letters were written, and the Dowager Countess departed quietly to the dower house at the estate's eastern edge, which she had always regarded as beneath her, and which she now occupied with a composure that was, Cecily thought, not entirely without dignity. Grief and pride are not always distinguishable. Lady Dorothea had protected Windermere as she understood Windermere, and had been wrong about what Windermere was. And this was a particular variety of loss that did not yield to easy contempt. Gerald Harwick sent one letter, was not answered, and did not send another. Baby William, who remained unaware that anything unusual had occurred, and who had developed a strong opinion about the superiority of the yellow ball over all other toys, continued to eat porridge and to regard Mrs. Senner, Paget's housekeeper's keys, as an object of immense fascination. Cecily kept the records. She had been told by a note on Ashmore paper in a firm and familiar hand that the position of parish clerk was formally hers if she wished it, with a proper stipend and the records house on the estate's maintenance rather than her own. She had looked at that note for some time. She had written back, in her father's best hand, which was also by now her own, that she accepted. The records house acquired new plaster in the walls that winter. It also acquired, on a Tuesday morning in January, a brazier that was somewhat too large for the room but was warm, and a knock at the door that she knew before she opened it, because she had been learning the particular quality of his step on the path. He brought the forged letter. He had kept it in his coat for 2 years, and he set it on the table beside the copy of Thomas's true letter, the one to her father about the banns, and he looked at the 2 documents together for a long moment. Then he put the forged letter in the brazier. She watched it go. He stood beside her at the brazier, and they watched it together, the paper catching and darkening, and then releasing. The ink, last of all. When it was done, she went to the cabinet and took out the banns letter. Thomas's letter, in Thomas's real hand, and she put it in the clear leather folder her father had used for documents that were to be preserved, and she set it on the shelf. He watched her do this. "Kept?" she said. "Yes," he said. He was very close, and the brazier was warm, and the records house was small, and when she turned from the shelf, he was looking at her in a way she had learned to read over these weeks, a particular quality of attention that she thought she would spend a very long time studying without exhausting its interest. He put his hands with care on either side of her face. His thumbs were warm. "Cecily," he said. She had been Miss Barrow in this room and to everyone in it for all of her 23 years. She had been the clerk's girl and the clerk's daughter, and she had been nobody worth looking at twice. And when he said her name in his low, unhurried voice, it was not like any of those things. It was like the register, a record of something true, set down in the only honest account the parish had of itself, unalterable and clear. She lifted her face to him. The kiss was careful and warm and full of everything that had been held in check since December, and had lasted long enough to constitute a beginning. Outside, the January light was thin and white on the park. The records house windows were small, and their glass was old, the kind that distorts slightly what it holds, so that the world inside looks warmer than the world outside, which is, Cecily had always thought, a reasonable account of what a good room does. Her father's files were in their cabinets. Thomas's letter was on the shelf in its clear folder, where it would stay. Baby William was in the nursery above the stable wing with his yellow ball. The register was accurate, and the record stood, and the light in the records house burned steady through the old uneven glass. Thank you for staying with her until the end. So the end.